Kaliningrad, long perceived as a strategic asset for exerting pressure on Europe under Vladimir Putin, has transformed into a major vulnerability for Moscow. In a departure from diplomatic norms, Polish military leaders have issued stark warnings about the enclave's potential destruction, stating a readiness to neutralize targets up to 300 km away. Concurrently, Lithuania has methodically constricted energy supplies and transit corridors. The result has been the cessation of railway traffic, the obstruction of road access, and the transformation of the vital sea corridor into a severe logistical bottleneck. The region has transitioned from a hub of military projection to an isolated territory encircled by NATO member states, effectively held captive. The Western alliance, particularly its eastern members Poland and Lithuania, is strategically leveraging Moscow's geographic disadvantage, the exclaves, separation from the Russian mainland, to create a point of leverage against Russia itself. The coordinated efforts of Warsaw and Vilnius to intensify the isolation of Kaliningrad have advanced beyond a mere embargo, culminating in a comprehensive and seemingly permanent strategic containment. The former perception of the region's invulnerability and strategic importance has been replaced by a pervasive sense of encirclement, helplessness, and an atmosphere of impending crisis. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, life in Kaliningrad possessed a distinct and dynamic character, setting it apart from the more somber environments of mainland Russia, including Moscow and Siberia. It represented Russia's most outwardly European region, with Western consumer brands prevalent, European cultural norms influencing its social spaces, and its inhabitants identifying more as integrated members of the Baltic community than as detached Russian nationals. The war, however, has systematically dismantled this connection, effectively reimposing an iron curtain and confining the populace to a state of isolation. The EU-NATO sanctions implemented following the Ukraine invasion, compounded by Lithuania's use of transit restrictions as a strategic tool, precipitated a logistical crisis in Kaliningrad, a shock to its system unparalleled since the Soviet Union's dissolution. The initial and most severe impact was the virtual elimination of road-based transport. Extended queues of trucks formed at border crossings, with vehicles waiting for days before being forced to return, leading to the collapse of the road haulage industry as the entry of European goods was prohibited. This resulted in mass unemployment for drivers and the failure of transport firms, which either mothballed their fleets or sold them for scrap. The loss of road access was tantamount to severing the region's primary artery to the outside world. Shortly thereafter, rail services were also disrupted. Lithuania enforced sanctions by refusing passage to designated strategic goods, compelling Russian trains to turn back. The transport of essential heavy materials such as cement for construction, steel for industry, and coal for energy was rendered impossible. The resulting paralysis of the railway system deprived Kaliningrad's industries of necessary raw materials, forcing factory closures and leaving construction projects incomplete. As the railway infrastructure fell into disuse, Moscow's inability to intervene became more apparent, highlighting how a technical measure by Lithuania had achieved a strategic paralysis of Russia. With both land and rail corridors effectively sealed, Moscow's final recourse was the maritime supply route via the Baltic Sea, which it promoted as a viable alternative. The Kremlin attempted to manage public perception and avert panic with assurances that all necessary goods could be transported by ship, thereby circumventing the blockade. While this strategy appeared feasible in theory, its practical implementation devolved into an unworkable, prohibitively expensive, and unsustainable logistical ordeal. The maritime option proved to be excessively costly, slow, and constrained by limited capacity. Critically, it was no longer a secure substitute for land-based transport. The plan centered on supplying Kaliningrad's ports from the UST Luga port near St. Petersburg. However, the number of available vessels was insufficient for the task, and the port infrastructures at both ends lacked the capacity to manage the increased cargo volume. Consequently, transportation costs escalated dramatically, and delivery times extended from days to weeks. This disruption severely affected industrial production schedules, led to shortages of fresh goods in retail outlets, and caused perishable items to spoil while awaiting offloading. The increased costs were transferred directly to the consumer, eroding the purchasing power of an already strained population and fueling significant inflation, with food price increases far exceeding the Russian national average. A severe deficit of ships and ferries resulted in long queues of trucks and containers at the ports, creating widespread logistical chaos. Existing ferries suffered from frequent mechanical failures, required extensive maintenance, and were inadequate in terms of capacity. The introduction of additional vessels, such as the Ursa Major, failed to alleviate the crisis, as they too were inefficient and insufficient to meet the scale of the demand. The human toll of this logistical breakdown was starkly illustrated by the plight of truck drivers, some of whom reported waiting at ports for over 2 months to secure passage on a ferry, forced to live out of their vehicles in a state of limbo. These delays represented not just a loss of time, but also the spoilage of cargo and financial ruin. The drivers' protests highlighted the broader collapse of the logistics sector. Key regional employers, such as the automotive manufacturer Avtovazie, a cornerstone of the local economy, and the motorcycle producer Bolt Motors, were compelled to suspend operations or slash capacity by as much as 90% due to the inability to procure necessary components. The shutdown of these factories, which was central to the regional economy, resulted in a loss of income for thousands of households and halted the influx of capital. Even attempts to secure supply chains with Chinese partners proved insufficient to bridge the gap, as China also faced challenges in delivering goods to the isolated exclave. This multifaceted problem is fostering a significant social crisis with the potential for unrest, directly impacting an estimated 15,000 to 18,000 workers and their families. The job losses extended beyond drivers to include mechanics, logistics personnel, warehouse staff, and customs agents. This growing demographic of unemployed individuals represents the largest and most disaffected group in the region, with discontent steadily mounting. According to data from RBC, unemployment has surged by an astonishing 21.7% since the start of the year, reaching a historical high. This figure serves as a clear indicator of the region's economic collapse. The labour market has effectively seized up, leaving the population with few options. With approximately 1 in 5 workers now unemployed, the conditions are becoming fertile for social instability. A development that has rendered the situation more critical and intractable for Russia is the complete geopolitical transformation of the Baltic Sea itself, which has turned decisively against Russian interests. The sea has ceased to be a conduit connecting Russia to the global stage and has instead become a barrier that contains it. The once formidable Baltic fleet, a symbol of Moscow's naval power, is now effectively confined to its home port, its operational freedom severely curtailed. With the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, the Baltic Sea has been transformed into what is functionally a NATO-controlled body of water, eliminating Russia's strategic depth and room for maneuver. The alliance now controls the sea's northern and southern shores, as well as its entry and exit points. All key locations, from the island of Gotland to the Danish Straits, are under NATO surveillance. This new reality means that the sea route to Kaliningrad is subject to NATO discretion. It can be disrupted, mined, or blockaded at any time. Russian vessels are now compelled to navigate a corridor under the constant watch of potential adversaries. Kaliningrad has thus become structurally indefensible, an isolated military outpost surrounded on all sides by land and sea by NATO members. The region's geography has become a profound liability for Russia. It is no longer a strategic forward base, but an exposed and untenable pocket, a potential kill zone. Military analysts now debate not whether the region could withstand a prolonged siege, but rather how quickly it would be forced to capitulate. Lithuania has explicitly and repeatedly articulated its readiness to halt all transit to Kaliningrad entirely, citing national security concerns. This threat has emerged as NATO's most potent deterrent against Moscow's long-standing pressure regarding the Suwalki corridor. Vilnius has sent an unambiguous message to Moscow. Any threat against us will be met by the severing of your exclave's lifeline, leaving your forces there exposed. This potential transit ban, when coupled with military warnings from Poland, implies that even the maritime route could be closed on short notice. In a crisis, NATO possesses the capability to mine the approaches to Kaliningrad's ports or impose a full naval blockade. Russia's capacity for a conventional military response is severely constrained, with its navy trapped within the Baltic. In a move laden with historical resonance, the German military has actively participated in this encirclement strategy, deploying soldiers and heavy armaments to areas near the Kaliningrad border as part of Poland's Eastern Shield operation. The redeployment of German Leopard tanks and other armoured vehicles to the east, close to the Russian frontier, represents a permanent strategic shift under the NATO framework. Berlin no longer regards Kaliningrad as a potential partner, but as a direct security threat, and is structuring its posture accordingly. The fact that German troops will be involved in constructing trenches, laying barbed wire, and setting up anti-tank defences in this area is tangible evidence that the region is considered an active or potential conflict zone. These preparations signal that NATO is either anticipating a Russian offensive or preparing for the complete isolation of Kaliningrad. The border is being fortified into a modern-day defensive line, rendering it nearly impenetrable. Russian military planners are reportedly acutely aware of this new reality, acknowledging it in internal assessments. Confidential wargame simulations are said to conclude that in any significant conflict with NATO, Kaliningrad's lines of communication would be severed within days, if not hours, and its airspace would be completely controlled by the alliance. A scenario in which reinforcements are unable to reach the enclave, leaving the garrisoned troops to their fate as supplies dwindle, is considered among the most dire possibilities contemplated by the Russian General Staff. Furthermore, Russia has already been compelled to redeploy some of its elite military units and advanced equipment from the region to the Ukrainian front. A portion of the S-400 air defense systems and marine units once based in Kaliningrad have reportedly been lost in combat in Ukraine. This has significantly weakened the exclave's defensive capabilities, leaving its fortifications undermanned and its armor depleted. The Russian population in Kaliningrad is increasingly cognizant of this looming outcome. In stark contrast to the triumphalist narratives presented on state television, the reality of empty streets, soaring prices, and a palpable sense of tension makes the danger feel immediate and personal. A feeling of hopelessness has permeated society, with many residents seeing no viable future for their children in the region. Rather than awaiting a rescue from the Kremlin that may never materialize, the people of Kaliningrad have begun taking matters into their own hands, with a panicked exodus now underway. As unemployment, insecurity, and corruption escalate, a historic wave of outmigration has commenced. Residents are abandoning their homes, careers, and personal histories in an attempt to reach mainland Russia or, where possible, other countries, treating the region like a failing vessel. According to a comprehensive sociological study, at least 1 in 5 adult inhabitants of the exclave has a close family member or relative who has already left. This rate is alarmingly high for the long-term viability of the community. Independent estimates, which account for potential manipulation of official figures, suggest that between 50,000 and 150,000 people will have permanently departed the oblast in the period from 2022 to 2025. For a region with a population of roughly 1 million, this represents a loss of 5% to 15% of its populace in just 3 years. A demographic disaster. Kaliningrad is currently undergoing the most rapid and severe population decline in its modern history. The Kremlin's response has been to obscure the crisis by ceasing the publication of birth and death statistics and concealing migration data. Rostat's decision to halt the release of monthly population figures is widely seen as an effort to hide the government's failure to manage the situation. An analysis of the departing population's profile reveals that it is precisely the demographic most crucial for an isolated region's future that is leaving. The emigrants are predominantly young, highly educated, multilingual individuals with professional skills in the technology and industrial sectors. This brain drain is set to leave Kaliningrad with an aging, dependent, and less productive population structure. When a generation to build its future is absent, the region itself has no prospects. In a final irony, Poland, Lithuania, and Germany have become the most common and accessible destinations for those fleeing a significant symbolic defeat for Russia. Its own citizens are seeking refuge and a future in the very NATO countries officially designated as adversaries. This crisis serves as a global testament to the collapse of the Kremlin's security posture in the Baltic, demonstrating that the heaviest price for Putin's war is being paid by its most European-oriented citizens in Kaliningrad. The present crisis in Kaliningrad is not merely a product of contemporary geopolitics, but also represents a profound historical reckoning. Today, Kaliningrad exists in a liminal state, geographically part of Europe and politically bound to Russia, yet culturally and economically estranged from both. As financial subsidies and military reinforcement from Moscow diminish, it is likely that the local populace, particularly the younger, more Europeanized generation, will increasingly question the logic of remaining tied to a mainland that is descending into isolation, economic hardship, and authoritarianism. The Western strategy, combining economic strangulation with military encirclement, appears to be yielding a decisive outcome at the very point where Putin's Baltic ambitions collide most starkly with geopolitical reality. The exclave, once portrayed as an impregnable fortress and an unsinkable aircraft carrier, has been neutralized by logistical strangulation and overwhelming NATO military pressure, effectively reducing it to an isolated and vulnerable military outpost. The strategic fall of Kaliningrad seems all but complete, with only a formal acknowledgement pending. This analysis invites further consideration of the long-term implications of such strategic encirclement. The developments in Kaliningrad offer a compelling case study on the effectiveness of coordinated economic and geopolitical pressure, and continued observation is warranted to understand the full scope of this regional transformation.